Cold mist hovered over the pond as sunrise barely touched the roofs of Silverbrook Ridge. My boots were still soaked from the mud, heavy with the smell of the same dirty water that had drowned my workshop just days earlier. In my hands was a thick steel lock, cold and final. The irrigation pump behind me hummed for the last time, then I shut it off. Across the hills, the perfect green golf course fell silent. Sprinklers died mid-spin. Water stopped flowing. Control shifted. Tires screeched on gravel. Victor Halbrook stormed toward me, red-faced, furious, already shouting before he reached the door. He accused me of sabotage, of destroying private property, of starting something I would regret. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I told him the truth. This pump house sat on my land, the same land his drainage project had flooded, the same water that had swallowed my tools, my father's legacy, my livelihood. His threats came fast: lawsuits, fines, seizure, ruin. But the anger in my chest had already burned into something colder. I snapped the lock shut. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the morning air. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," Victor yelled. No. The mistake was flooding my livelihood, and now the war had begun. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Before everything turned into a fight, life was simple, quiet, predictable in the best way. My land sat just outside the polished stone entrance of Silverbrook Ridge Estates, a place where trimmed hedges, perfect lawns, and expensive silence tried to convince the world that nothing ever went wrong behind those gates. But my land was older than their gates, older than their golf course, older than their rules. My father bought this soil long before developers arrived with blueprints and promises. And on this land, he built the workshop that became my life. It was a cedar structure with a tin roof that sang during rainstorms and glowed warm gold in the evening sun. Every beam carried his fingerprints. Every tool had a memory attached to it. That workshop wasn't just where I worked. It was where I learned patience, where I learned pride, where I learned what it meant to build something with your own hands and stand behind it. Custom tables, cabinets, handcrafted pieces, my livelihood, my history, and my peace all lived inside those walls. Most days, the only sound I heard was wind moving through the trees or the distant hum of lawn equipment from inside Silverbrook. I kept to myself, and they kept to theirs. The HOA never bothered me much in the early years. We existed side by side, two different worlds, separated by a gate and an understanding that we didn't interfere with each other. My closest neighbor, Caleb Dunn, lived half a mile down the road. Practical, quiet, the kind of man who spoke only when he had something worth saying. He helped when storms hit, lent tools when needed, and never asked questions that didn't matter. If something serious was happening, Caleb usually noticed before anyone else. At first, the HOA seemed distant but harmless. Polite letters occasionally arrived, mostly notices about road maintenance near the boundary or landscaping work close to the golf course. Nothing threatening, nothing unusual. Then I met Victor Halbrook at a community open event they hosted near the clubhouse. Perfect smile, perfect handshake, voice smooth like polished marble. He spoke like a man used to control, but he wore it behind charm. He thanked me for coexisting peacefully with the development and said they valued good relationships with neighboring properties. At the time, I believed him. The first signs of trouble were small enough to ignore. One week, heavy construction equipment appeared behind the far edge of the golf course near the ninth fairway, close to the slope that ran toward my land. Trucks came and went. Workers dug long lines into the red earth, shaping something that looked like drainage channels. I assumed they were fixing water pooling on their side golf courses needed constant maintenance. It wasn't my concern. A few days later, Caleb stopped by while I was stacking fresh-cut lumber. He nodded toward the distant machines and said, "You might want to keep an eye on that. They've redirected runoff before." I shrugged it off. The HOA wouldn't risk damaging land outside their control. That would be reckless. Expensive. Illegal. I believed logic would protect me. I believed boundaries mattered. Then came the morning everything changed. I woke to a smell heavy, sour, wrong. Wet wood. Not the clean scent of rain, but the choking odor of something soaked too long. I hurried toward the workshop, boots crunching gravel, heart already tightening before I reached the door. When I pushed it open, the wood scraped against the floor like it was dragging through mud. Water covered everything. Dark, filthy water stretched from wall to wall, reflecting the dim light like a shallow swamp. My table saw stood half submerged, rust already blooming across its surface. Toolboxes floated open, their contents scattered. Lumber swelled and twisted. My father's old lathe sat silent, soaked, aging years in a single night. The sound was the worst part, quiet water lapping gently against metal and wood like it didn't understand what it had destroyed. It took 2 days to pump it out. 2 days of watching 10 years of work dissolve into damage. Caleb arrived with a sump pump and didn't say much, just shook his head slowly, the way people do when they already know the truth before you're ready to hear it. When the water finally receded, I followed the slope behind the workshop, boots sinking into soft earth. That's when I saw it. A long, fresh trench carved into the soil, red clay still wet and loose, cutting a clean path from the HOA storm culvert straight toward my land. Not natural erosion, not random overflow. Too precise, too direct. I stood there staring at the trench, the silence around me suddenly heavier than before. This wasn't an accident. I didn't wait long before calling Victor Halbrook. I stood in the middle of my ruined workshop while the smell of soaked wood and rust still filled the air, staring at tools that had taken years to earn and seconds to lose. When he answered, his voice was calm, polished, almost bored, like nothing in the world could possibly be urgent enough to disturb his morning. I told him what I found. The trench, the flood, the destruction. I didn't shout. I didn't accuse. I simply asked the question that mattered. Did your drainage project redirect water onto my land? There was a pause, short, controlled. Then came the answer. It's natural runoff, Ethan. Water flows downhill. Nothing unusual, natural. That word echoed inside my head as I looked at warped lumber, silent machines, and muddy water stains climbing the workshop walls like a record of damage. Natural didn't carve a fresh trench through red soil. Natural didn't drown a man's livelihood overnight. I pushed harder, told him the trench was new. Told him the water came from their storm culvert. Told him my workshop had been destroyed. Victor didn't deny it. He reframed it. Carefully, smoothly, like a man who had practiced turning responsibility into air. You'll recover, he said. These things happen. I'd advise against making claims without proof. The call ended before I could say anything else. Not because I ran out of words, but because I realized he wasn't going to give me anything useful, not truth, not accountability, not even basic concern. So I started documenting everything, every ruined tool, every warped board, every inch of water damage. I photographed rust blooming across steel surfaces, swelling wood splitting at the grain, electrical systems soaked beyond repair. The numbers grew fast. Replacement costs stacked higher than I wanted to admit. My workshop wasn't just damaged, it was crippled. My business, my income, my stability, all suddenly hanging by a thread. That's when I contacted Mara Salazar. Mara wasn't loud or dramatic. She didn't promise victories or speak in slogans. She spoke in facts. Land use law, property boundaries, liability. The kind of language that doesn't care about emotions, only records. I handed her the photos, the survey maps my father kept, and every detail I had gathered. She studied everything carefully, tracing lines across faded documents, comparing them to county records. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but serious. If that trench was deliberately cut to redirect stormwater onto your property and they don't have a drainage easement, they could be liable for damage. Liable. The word felt heavy. Real. But it also meant nothing without proof strong enough to survive a fight. And Silverbrook Ridge didn't look like the kind of place that lost fights easily. A week later, the HOA sent their response. Polite, professional, cold. The letter expressed sympathy for the inconvenience but denied responsibility entirely. It described the flooding as a result of natural stormwater movement and insisted all work had been completed within regulatory compliance. No admission, no apology, no offer to repair. Just distance. Then came the line that made my hands tighten around the paper. Mr. Mercer is advised to exercise caution before making unfounded allegations against the association. I didn't need Mara to explain what that meant. It wasn't just denial, it was a warning, a quiet threat wrapped in legal language. Accuse us, and you will regret it. Days passed. My frustration turned into something heavier than anger, something sharper than disbelief. I walked the land repeatedly, tracing slopes, studying boundaries, measuring distances. I refused to accept that this was just bad luck. There had to be something they missed, something real. And then Mara called again. Her tone had changed. I found something in the county survey records, she said. The irrigation pump house they use for the golf course, it's entirely on your parcel. Not shared, not disputed. Yours. I stood still, letting the words settle. And there's more, she continued. There is no recorded water easement, no formal water rights agreement. Their use of that pump has been informal, no contract. No legal claim, just assumption. For the first time since the flood, the weight in my chest shifted, not gone, but different, balanced. Because suddenly, this wasn't just about damage anymore. The balance of power had changed. The pressure didn't come all at once. It came in layers. First, another letter. Thicker this time, heavier paper, sharper tone. It accused me of interference, of spreading false claims about the association's construction practices. It suggested that continued defamatory statements could expose me to legal consequences. I read it twice, then a third time, trying to understand how I had become the aggressor in a situation where my workshop still smelled like swamp water. Then came the rumors. Caleb heard them first. At the small hardware store near the highway, someone mentioned that I had always been difficult. Another said I was trying to extort the HOA for money. By the end of the week, I was the bitter outsider attacking a respected community. The story had been rewritten, and I wasn't invited to edit it. Victor Halbrook was careful. He never called to shout. He never threatened directly. Instead, he spoke in smooth warnings. You're escalating something unnecessarily, he told me during our second conversation. These things have a way of getting expensive for everyone involved, not just me. The implication was clear. If I pushed, they would push harder. 2 days later, a county inspector showed up at my gate, said he received a complaint about unpermitted structures near the property line. He walked around my workshop slowly, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning like he expected to find something illegal. He didn't. Everything had been there for years, documented and permitted, but the message was delivered. You are being watched. The following week, another notice arrived, this time questioning my fence line. Then one about environmental runoff concerns. Each complaint forced me to respond, to prove compliance, to spend time and money defending things that had never been issues before. Caleb stood beside me one evening, arms folded, watching headlights pass behind the HOA gates. They never lose, he said quietly. They've got lawyers on retainer and board members with too much time. You sure you want this fight? The honest answer was no. I didn't want it. I wanted my workshop dry. My tools functional. My life back to quiet mornings and sawdust. But that option had been washed away. The HOA board escalated next. A formal notice arrived stating that I was interfering with community infrastructure by obstructing drainage pathways. It warned that legal action could be pursued if I attempted to alter or block water flow in any way. I laughed when I read it, not because it was funny, but because the audacity was almost impressive. They flooded my land, and now they were warning me not to interfere with the path they carved. Emotionally, the toll started to settle in. Sleep became shallow. Every engine sound on the road made me glance toward the window. I started double-checking locks at night, replaying conversations in my head, wondering if I had missed something, some regulation, some technicality that would crush me if they decided to file suit. Victor called again one afternoon, voice steady as ever. You're making accusations that damage property values, he said. That's not something we can ignore. I didn't damage anything, I replied. You redirected water onto my land? That's your interpretation. There it was again, reframing, minimizing, turning destruction into perspective. Behind the scenes, I began doing something different. Instead of reacting, I started studying. Every night, I spread survey maps across my kitchen table, old deeds, county filings, water management records. I traced property lines with my finger like they were lifelines. I reviewed decades of documentation my father had kept in a dented metal cabinet. Notes, hand-drawn boundary sketches, correspondence from years ago when the development first broke ground. I noticed something that hadn't seemed important before. There was no signed agreement granting irrigation access. I called Mara again and asked her to dig deeper into water rights filings. She moved quickly, pulling archived county records and environmental permits connected to Silverbrook Ridge. A few days later, she asked me to come by her office. Her desk was covered in copies of plats and easement filings. They have recorded drainage easements within their community, she explained, pointing to one highlighted section. But not across your land. And the pump house? I asked. She slid a survey across the desk. It was clear, precise, undeniable. The irrigation pump house, the one feeding the golf course, sat entirely inside my boundary lines. No shared ownership, she said, no recorded easement for water extraction. As far as the county is concerned, that structure is on your property. I leaned back in the chair, heart beating slower now, not from fear, but from something steadier. For how long? I asked. Mara gave a small, almost incredulous shake of her head. From what I can see, since the beginning, decades. I thought about all the years the HOA had drawn water from that pond, all the time sprinklers had kept their fairways perfect, all the board meetings where they discussed budgets and improvements, assuming access was permanent. It wasn't permanent. It had been a handshake agreement between my father and the original developer. A neighborly understanding, no contract, no filing, no legal right. They had been operating on assumption, and assumption is fragile when confronted with boundaries. The intimidation, the letters, the inspectors, they were meant to corner me, to exhaust me, to remind me that I was one man standing outside a gated machine. But now I knew something they didn't expect me to know. The irrigation pump house was fully on my land, and legally, they were drawing water based on nothing more than trust that no longer existed. The moment Mara confirmed it, everything changed, not loudly, not suddenly, but inside me, something shifted from weight to balance. You control access, she said, tapping the survey again. Legally, they cannot use that pump house without your permission. There is no recorded easement, no water rights filing, nothing binding, just decades of informal use. I stared at the paper, tracing the boundary line that wrapped around the pond and enclosed the small concrete structure the HOA had treated like their own. For years, water had flowed from that pump into their perfect fairways, their spotless greens, their carefully curated world behind gates, and all of it had been based on trust, on a handshake between my father and a developer long gone. Trust they broke the moment they flooded my workshop. Still, the decision wasn't simple. I knew what shutting off that pump would do. The golf course would suffer first, but beyond that were homeowners, people who had nothing to do with trenches, drainage plans, or boardroom decisions. Families, retirees, workers. Not all of them were Victor Halbrook. Not all of them had chosen this fight. That thought stayed with me longer than I expected. For 2 nights, I barely slept. I walked through the workshop, stepping over warped boards and silent machines, touching tools that no longer worked. I remembered my father sanding the workbench smooth with steady hands, telling me that what you build with integrity should never be surrendered to people who don't respect it. I remembered the smell of fresh cedar before it was replaced by the stench of muddy water. They hadn't hesitated when their trench sent water toward my land. They hadn't paused when my livelihood drowned. And they hadn't offered repair, responsibility, or even honesty. The guilt began to fade, replaced by clarity. Enough. The next morning, I drove into town and walked into a hardware store that smelled like steel and dust. I didn't rush. I studied the rows carefully until I found what I wanted, a thick, industrial-grade steel lock. Heavy, weather-resistant, built to last. The kind of lock meant to mark a boundary that wouldn't be crossed. When I placed it on the counter, the cashier glanced at it and said, "That's a serious lock." I nodded. "It needs to be." Back home, I didn't act immediately. Strategy mattered more than speed. I documented everything. Every inch of flood damage, every ruined tool and warped plank. I calculated replacement costs, repair estimates, lost income, structural impact. I photographed the trench behind the workshop from multiple angles, capturing the clean line of redirected water and the fresh-cut soil that proved it wasn't natural. I gathered old maps, drainage records, county approvals, construction timelines, anything that showed the sequence of events. Night after night, my kitchen table filled with paper. Mara reviewed everything, organizing evidence with quiet precision. She prepared documentation strong enough to survive a courtroom, not just an argument. Meanwhile, the HOA continued their pressure letters, inspections, warnings, but something had changed in me. Their threats didn't feel as heavy anymore. Not because they were weaker, but because I now understood the ground beneath my feet. Power, I realized, wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was written in property lines drawn decades ago. By the third morning, I was ready. Dawn came cold and silent, mist hovering low over the pond, like a memory refusing to leave. My boots sank slightly into damp earth as I walked toward the pump house. The structure looked ordinary: concrete walls, metal door, simple latch. Nothing about it suggested it controlled the water that kept an entire golf course alive. For years, they had opened this door whenever they wanted, turned valves, drew water, assumed access was permanent. I stood there for a long moment, hand resting on the lock in my pocket, feeling the weight of what I was about to do. This wasn't revenge. It was boundary. I slid the steel loop through the latch and snapped the lock shut. The click echoed louder than it should have, sharp in the quiet morning air. Final. Irreversible. The pump continued humming inside for a few seconds, then I reached in and shut the system down. Somewhere across the hills, sprinklers would soon fall silent. Control would shift. I stepped back and looked at the locked door, the cold metal reflecting the first light of sunrise. For the first time since the flood, the HOA had no control. The silence came first. For years, mornings at Silverbrook Ridge began with the steady whisper of sprinklers sweeping across perfect green hills. Water spinning in silver arcs, feeding the illusion of control the HOA worked so hard to maintain. But the morning after I locked the pump house, that sound never came. The fairways stayed dry. The greens held their breath under the rising sun. And behind those gates, confusion began to spread. By the second day, the grass started to change color. Not all at once, just thin yellow edges creeping across the putting greens. Faint patches spreading like cracks in polished glass. Maintenance crews walked the course longer than usual, checking valves, inspecting lines, restarting systems that no longer responded. They didn't yet understand the real problem, but they could feel it. By the third day, panic began. Contractors arrived in white trucks, digging near control boxes, inspecting pumps, testing pressure. Temporary wells were drilled in hurried attempts to replace lost irrigation, but the groundwater yield was weak, inconsistent, unreliable. Water rationing began quietly. Certain sections of the course went dry first. The illusion of perfection was slipping, and inside Silverbrook Ridge, appearances mattered more than almost anything. Victor Halbrook called that afternoon. His tone had changed, still controlled, but tighter now. "You've made your point," he said. "Remove the lock. We can discuss your concerns." I didn't argue. I didn't negotiate. I told him the truth. My workshop is still destroyed. Nothing has been repaired. Nothing has been acknowledged. When that changes, we can talk. The line went quiet for a moment. Then the pressure returned. A cease and desist letter arrived 2 days later. Thick, formal, filled with legal phrasing, accusing me of unlawful interference with essential infrastructure. It demanded immediate restoration of pump access and warned of legal consequences if I failed to comply. Mara read it carefully, then set it down. "They're bluffing," she said. "You are within your rights. Do not respond emotionally. Respond with facts." So I did. I sent an invoice, detailed, itemized, documented. Replacement costs for machinery, structural damage, lost materials, electrical repair, restoration, and lost business income. Photographs attached. Engineering assessments included. The number wasn't small, and it wasn't exaggerated. The response from the HOA came quickly. Another letter. Another denial. Another attempt to shift blame back toward natural conditions. But beneath their words, I could feel something different. Pressure. Inside Silverbrook Ridge, things were beginning to crack. Rumors started leaking beyond the gates. Caleb heard them from people he knew who worked maintenance jobs inside the community. Some homeowners were asking questions. Why were water trucks being discussed? Why were certain greens turning brown? Why was the irrigation failing when dues had just increased for course maintenance? The HOA tried to keep things quiet, but silence is fragile when perfection begins to fade. Caleb came by one evening, leaning against his truck, watching the distant hills where once bright fairways were slowly losing color. "You're not the only one they've pushed," he said. "Couple of folks had drainage problems years back. Fines, inspections, pressure. They never fought. Just paid." He started reaching out quietly. Neighbors, former residents, people who had stories but never voices. Not a rebellion. Not loud, just awareness spreading, one conversation at a time. Meanwhile, the HOA scrambled harder. More contractors. More temporary fixes. Pumps tested. Lines flushed. Water rationed. But the truth was simple. Their source was gone. And then I made my second move. Not dramatic, not destructive, just precise. I lowered the pond level back to its natural height. For years, the HOA had depended on the artificially maintained water level to sustain full irrigation. Without it, even if they somehow regained access to the pump house, the volume wouldn't be enough to keep the course alive. I didn't drain it completely. I didn't damage anything. I simply restored the pond to what it had always been before their dependence reshaped it, balance. The effect was immediate. Within days, water pressure dropped further. Brown spread faster across fairways. Maintenance crews began working overnight, trying to save the most visible areas first. The illusion of control, the carefully constructed perfection Silverbrook Ridge depended on, was fading under the sun. And then came the trucks. Massive tankers rolling slowly through the stone entrance, hoses coiled like lifelines, delivering emergency water to keep the course from collapsing completely. They came early, they came late, they came every day. Expensive, visible, impossible to hide. Silverbrook Ridge had always projected strength, stability, wealth. Now it was hauling water to survive, and every mile those trucks traveled cost them. The HOA was bleeding money. The invitation arrived late in the afternoon, sealed in an official envelope, stamped with the crest of Silverbrook Ridge Estates. No greeting, no courtesy. Just a formal notice requesting my presence at an emergency HOA board meeting the following evening. Attendance, it said, was strongly advised. Victor was ready to end this. I knew his strategy before I even stepped inside that clubhouse. Public pressure, authority, narrative control. He wanted the community to see me as the problem, a reckless outsider choking their water supply, damaging property values, threatening stability. If he could win the room, he could force compliance. Maybe even justify legal action. But I wasn't walking in alone. Mara arrived 10 minutes before the meeting, carrying a slim leather folder filled with documents that had taken weeks to assemble. Surveys, damage reports, engineering assessments, county records, every piece of truth we had gathered, organized with quiet precision. She didn't speak much on the drive, only said, "Stay calm, facts win rooms like this." The clubhouse smelled like polished wood and citrus cleaner. Clean, controlled, artificially calm. About 40 homeowners sat scattered across the room, their expressions uneasy. Some looked irritated, others looked confused. A few looked tired people who had watched their perfect golf course slowly fade under a relentless sun. Victor Halbrook stood at the front, posture straight, voice smooth, already in command. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," he began. "We are dealing with an unfortunate situation involving interference with community infrastructure." He didn't say my name at first. He didn't need to. Every eye in the room had already found me. Victor described irrigation failure, operational disruption, and unauthorized restriction of water access. He framed it carefully, never angry, never loud, just controlled concern. He spoke like a man protecting order from chaos. Then he gestured toward me. "Mr. Mercer has taken actions that have directly impacted this community." The room shifted. Some faces hardened, others looked uncertain. Victor believed he had the advantage. I stood slowly. "I didn't take anything from this community," I said, voice steady. "I protected what was already mine." Murmurs spread. Victor moved quickly, trying to regain control. "The irrigation structure is essential to maintaining shared property," he replied. "Your interference has caused financial damage and operational disruption." I nodded once, then opened the folder Mara had handed me. "I have damage too." I passed the first set of photographs forward. They moved from hand to hand across the front row. The room grew quieter with each image. Floodwater covering the workshop floor. Machinery drowned in mud. Lumber swollen and split. Rust spreading across steel tools. Electrical systems soaked and destroyed. No exaggeration. No emotion. Just truth. "That happened 3 weeks ago," I said, "after the HOA redirected stormwater through a trench cut from your culvert straight toward my property." Victor tried to respond, but someone in the audience spoke first. "You flooded his land?" Another voice followed. "Why weren't we told about this drainage change?" The room began shifting, not loud, not chaotic, but uncertain. Questions replacing assumptions. Victor adjusted his stance, voice tightening slightly but still controlled. "The drainage project complied with regulatory standards. Any water movement was natural and unavoidable. Mara stepped forward then, calm and precise. County records show no drainage easement across Mr. Mercer's property. Redirecting stormwater without consent exposes the association to liability. Silence followed, not confusion. Not noise, just the sound of a room recalculating. Victor's confidence didn't disappear, but it cracked. He shifted strategy, trying to redirect attention back toward authority. Regardless, Mr. Mercer's continued restriction of irrigation access cannot continue, he said. The association cannot function under unilateral interference. But the room no longer belonged entirely to him. Someone asked about the water trucks. Another asked about rising costs. Another asked why the pump house was on my land at all. The questions weren't hostile, they were logical, and logic weakens control faster than anger ever could. Victor raised his hand, regaining partial order. The board will now proceed with a compliance vote, he announced. Failure to restore access may result in legal enforcement and financial penalties. There it was, the final push. The moment he believed would corner me in front of everyone. I closed the folder slowly, heart steady, voice calm. Before you vote, the room went still. You should see this. I stepped forward and placed the final folder on the long polished table. The room was silent now. Not the calm silence from earlier, but the kind that comes when people sense something irreversible is about to happen. I opened the folder slowly and slid out the first document. A full property survey, clear boundary lines. The irrigation pump house fully enclosed within my land. Murmurs began immediately. I didn't rush. I placed the next document beside it, county records showing no registered water easement, no legal right for the HOA to extract water from my pond. Then came the engineering report, detailing the redirected drainage trench, complete with soil disturbance analysis, slope measurements, and water flow modeling proving the flood had not been natural. Finally, I placed the photographs again. Floodwater filling my workshop, machines submerged, years of work destroyed in silence. This is not opinion, I said quietly. This is documentation. Victor tried to interrupt, but Mara spoke first. Based on these findings, the association may be liable for unauthorized drainage redirection, property damage, and continued use of water infrastructure without legal easement. Financial exposure could include repair costs, lost income, land impact, and civil penalties. The room changed. Not slowly, instantly. People shifted in their seats. Some turned toward Victor. Others began whispering. A few leaned forward, studying the documents like they were seeing something they had never been shown before, the truth behind the polished image of Silverbrook Ridge. One homeowner stood up. You told us irrigation failure was a mechanical issue. Another voice followed. Are we legally exposed because of this? Victor's composure started to crack. He attempted to regain control, voice still measured but no longer smooth. The association acted within reasonable operational standards, he said. These claims are being exaggerated. Mara didn't raise her voice. The survey and county records are not exaggeration. Silence again, but heavier now. Not uncertainty, realization. Someone near the back asked about the cost of the water trucks. Another asked about rising dues. Another demanded to know why the board had never disclosed the drainage project affecting external property. Victor's authority began slipping, not through shouting but through logic, question by question. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. For weeks they had been bleeding money quietly. Contractors, emergency irrigation, reputation damage. Now that cost had a visible cause, and it wasn't me. Victor made one last attempt. You are harming this community, he said, turning toward me. Dozens of homeowners are affected. I met his gaze calmly. My workshop was my community. And it was destroyed. No anger, no raised voice. Just fact. The room stayed still for a long moment. Then one of the board members leaned toward Victor and whispered something sharp enough to change the air. Another checked papers. Another shook his head slightly. The calculation had begun. Legal risk, financial loss, public trust, all shifting at once. Finally, a senior board member stood. The association will enter immediate negotiation to resolve this matter, he said carefully. We will review repair obligations, infrastructure agreements, and water access terms. Victor looked at him, stunned, not expecting the decision to move without him. The man who had controlled every narrative, every meeting, every pressure tactic, suddenly found himself outnumbered in his own room. For the first time, Victor Halbrook had no control over the outcome. The meeting dissolved slowly. People didn't speak loudly, but the tone had changed. No longer defensive. No longer certain, just aware that something fundamental had shifted. As I gathered the documents, I glanced once toward Victor. His posture had changed. Shoulders tighter, jaw set, eyes no longer sharp with command but clouded with something unfamiliar, loss. The war hadn't ended yet, but the power had moved. The HOA agreed to settlement negotiations, and for the first time, Victor looked defeated. The negotiations took weeks, but for the first time since the flood, the direction was forward. Not pressure, not denial. Resolution. Engineers arrived first, walking the land with measuring tools and quiet focus. The trench that had once carved destruction toward my workshop was redesigned properly, graded, redirected, controlled within legal boundaries. No more silent arrows pointing at my livelihood. No more assumption that my land was simply the lowest place for their problems to flow. Then came the rebuild. The old workshop had to come down piece by piece. Watching it happen wasn't easy. Every beam removed felt like losing a memory, like saying goodbye to the years my father and I had spent shaping that space into something more than wood and nails. But the new structure rose stronger. Reinforced concrete foundation, treated framing, proper drainage systems, backup sump channels. Protection built into every corner so water could never again take what I had built. The day the new tools arrived, the air inside the workshop changed. Fresh steel, clean oil, smooth surfaces untouched by rust. The new table saw hum steady and strong. The lathe turned without hesitation. The smell of cedar returned, warm and familiar, filling the space like something long lost had finally come home. The legal agreement followed soon after. No more handshakes. No more assumptions. A formal water lease was signed, clear terms, yearly payment, strict limits on usage, scheduled access, and written consequences if boundaries were crossed. The pump house now had two locks, mine and theirs, symbolizing something simple but powerful, shared use, not control. Victor Halbrook did not remain president long after the meeting. Pressure from homeowners, financial scrutiny, and loss of trust quietly removed him from authority. There was no dramatic exit, no public collapse, just silence where his voice once dominated. Leadership shifted, transparency followed. Meetings became open, decisions documented. The illusion of control replaced by something more honest. Some homeowners came to speak with me personally. Not all, but enough. One apologized for believing the rumors. Another admitted they never knew about the drainage change. A retired couple thanked me quietly, saying the community had needed accountability long before this happened. Their words didn't erase the past, but they changed the present. Caleb stood beside me one evening outside the workshop, watching the sunset reflect off the fresh roof panels. "Told you they never lose," he said. I shook my head slightly. "They didn't lose," I replied. "They learned, and so did I." Peace returned, but it wasn't the same quiet from before. This peace carried something stronger: respect. Not fear, not tension, just understanding. The HOA no longer saw my land as a convenient low point for their problems. And I no longer saw their gates as untouchable power. Some fights aren't about winning. They're about boundaries. One morning, sunlight streamed through the workshop windows, falling across fresh cedar and clean steel. The air smelled right again. Calm. Steady. Mine. I stood there for a long moment, hands resting on the workbench my father once touched, realizing something simple but true. I was never the low point on their drainage map. I was the boundary. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?